Right, so last night we saw Chris Eubank Jr. return to the ring 13 months on from a career best performance over Liam Smith when he boxed on a huge Riyadh season card in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, taking on Kamil Szeremeta, who he stopped within 7 rounds, and within moments of doing so, the rivalry was reignited with old foe and hopefully future opponent Conor Benn. So in this video, we are going to speak about Chris Eubank Jr.'s performance last night. We are going to look ahead to the fight with Conor Benn, and I am going to give you lot my opinion on who will be a favourite going into that fight. But before we get into all that, people, welcome back to the Joey Knight Boxing channel. If you are new around here, please do me a massive favour. Hit the subscribe button, smash the like button right now. Let's get into the video. Now, the first thing that I want to do here is actually give Chris Eubank Jr. some credit, because I've heard multiple media sources already rubbishing the win and saying that Kamil Szeremeta was completely overmatched against Chris Eubank Jr. And I actually do think that's really unfair. I don't actually think that's entirely true. You know, you look at Szeremeta, he's a former European champion. He was unbeaten in 6 fights. His only previous losses were to men that were considered to be a far, far level above what Chris Eubank Jr. is in Gennady Golovkin and Jaime Munguia. And when you look at his performance in the ring, I understand that he got caught cold and knocked down early on with that lovely right hand from Eubank Jr. However, he did battle on. He did fire back. He did almost come back into the fight at times and test Eubank Jr.'s will to win and his chin. So I do have to give him the credit. And like I said on the stream last night on the Pain Game, if you guys haven't watched that, definitely check out the Pain Game, linked in the description. Every fighter now that comes onto these Riyadh season cards has added incentive on any other fight that they have had before, with the allure of more big nights to come and therefore more big paydays to come. So for Kamil Szeremeta, if he had have caused the huge upset win last night and he had to beat Chris Eubank Jr., there would have been a guarantee of further fights on Riyadh season. So to put a man down 4 times and stop him in a similar amount of time to that of Munguia and that of Golovkin tells me that we have to give Chris Eubank Jr. credit here. But did Eubank Jr. look good in this fight? Well, the obvious answer is yes. He put him down 4 times and stopped him. But I do think there is more than meets the eye here. So let's speak about my areas of concern for Chris Eubank Jr. Now, the first area of concern for me is the weight. Chris Eubank Jr. made it no secret throughout fight week that the weight cut was getting harder than it had been in the past. We have seen Chris Eubank Jr. box at 168 pounds recently, and I think that coming back down to 160 pounds is a clever move in terms of the fights that he'll be targeting next, and maybe looking at the division as a whole and feeling that it could be an easier division to pick up a recognised world title win. However, what I would say is that 160 pound limit will become a lot harder as you get into your mid to late 30s, and making that weight was definitely a struggle for Eubank Jr. Seeing him in and around fight week, he did look gaunt in the face, and you saw the footage of him on the treadmill, I think, or the bike, trying to make that weight as the week went on. And I actually believe that the effects of trying to make that weight did show themselves in the fight. Chris Eubank Jr. has been a fighter that I've always credited for having an unbelievable engine, and usually when he smells blood, that engine will kick in, and he will do his utmost to empty the clip and get his opponent out of there. And despite a few times it looking like Chris Eubank Jr. may look to force a stoppage in this one, it didn't look like he had the same engine that he had in the past, and that could come down to making the weight and therefore not having as much in the tank as before. And the third thing that I may worry about, and some of you may pour cold water on this, but I would say is the chin of Chris Eubank Jr. Now, I don't think that Chris Eubank Jr. was ever in trouble in this fight. However, I do have to look at the quality of his opponent in there and then question, would another man have been able to get you in more trouble in that moment? Because being in trouble or not, the chin was there to be hit. at times. And unlike previous fights from Chris Eubank Jr., when he got hit, he didn't immediately look to fight fire with fire. And although some people could say that that's not the best method, especially after what we saw against Liam Smith, I do think that that was one of Chris Eubank Jr.'s real qualities in the past, was the ability to be able to come back from big shots and straight away stick it on the man in front of him. And last night, we didn't see that as much. However, I will conclude all of this by just saying that that could be the effects of having to bring that weight down all the way from what we're hearing was about 190 pounds at the start of camp, losing that 30 odd pounds, coming back down to the middleweight limit, and therefore obviously being in the ring looking like Chris Eubank Jr., but maybe not feeling like Chris Eubank Jr. of the past. And with another camp under his belt, staying in the gym, knowing that he does have a date now in mind and an opponent in mind, this camp may be a lot easier than the last camp. And therefore, we may see a way better version of Chris Eubank Jr. in the next camp. It's very easy to look at Chris Eubank Jr., look at the fact that he was knocked out by Liam Smith, and look at his age now and say, well, he's on the decline. But sometimes we can be reading false data. And I think just to assume that Chris Eubank Jr. is on the decline right now may not be true. This could be a version of Chris Eubank Jr. who has learnt from his mistakes in the past and is now maturing, and therefore is now opting to take more time with his opponents. You know, I do believe that the Liam Smith rematch was a career best win for Chris Eubank Jr. And one thing about the Liam Smith rematch is Chris Eubank Jr. did not force it. He boxed well off his jab and his lead hand in general and waited until his opponent was ready to come out of there. And when you look at the variety of shots from Eubank Jr. last night, I do think that we are seeing that maturity in there, you know. He hurt Kamil Szeremeta to the head, and then he'd made the clever move of going downstairs to the body, and ultimately it was the body shots that finished the fight. So I'm not going to jump to a conclusion that Chris Eubank Jr. is a lesser version of himself just off the back of what I actually think is a pretty impressive win. If I had have read out to you before the fight that Chris Eubank Jr. was going to drop this man 4 times, I think that's the same amount of times as Golovkin dropped him, and stop him in the same round as Golovkin stopped him, I think you would have said, well, it must have been an impressive night at the office for Eubank Jr. Now, Conor Benn got straight in the ring after that, Spanish villain vibes with the slick back hair, and it all kicked off. And now we are hearing that Conor Benn's situation with the British Boxing Board of Control could be resolved in the next few weeks, and that the fight could be penciled in for February in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which, by the way, would be absolutely mental. Could you imagine a main event of Anthony Joshua against Daniel Dubois and a co-main event of Conor Benn against Chris Eubank Jr.? What a night of boxing that would be, and I just pray to God that if it does happen, I am out here once again to cover it. So when the fight inevitably does happen, do we go with the young up-and-comer in Conor Benn, or do we now go with the more experienced and battle-hardened man in Chris Eubank Jr.? Well, for me, this is actually a 50-50 fight. And the mad thing about this fight is, if you look at it, it's the first time in a high-profile fight that Chris Eubank Jr. will be the more experienced man in the ring. Chris Eubank Jr. didn't have loads and loads of amateur pedigree when he turned pro, and also, when you look at his pro career, it was really littered with, I don't want to call them knockover jobs, but really overmatched opponents. And it ultimately culminated in him taking a massive jump up against Billy Joe Saunders. That was his first high-profile fight. And if you look at that, Billy Joe Saunders had way more amateur pedigree than Chris Eubank Jr. and had also boxed at a way higher level in the pro ranks than Chris Eubank Jr. Following that, you had the likes of George Groves, James DeGale, Arthur Abraham, Liam Smith twice, who were all way more experienced than Chris Eubank Jr. So for this one to be the first time that Chris Eubank Jr. comes in as the senior figure in a fight could mean that Chris Eubank Jr. uses that senior experience, uses that know-how that he has acquired over the years, and therefore could mean that against Conor Benn, Chris Eubank Jr. actually opts to box and put on a boxing display that he has acquired through years of experience in the pro ranks. Now, so far inside a boxing ring, I have loved what I've seen from Conor Benn, and the fact that he's got to the point he has right now is something that you've got to hold your hands up and give him a real round of applause, because I remember when I first saw Conor Benn turn pro on a Matchroom show, he really didn't look like he was a cut above any of some of the sons of former greats that we've seen, you know. There wasn't much of a difference when Conor Benn first turned pro between himself and, let's say, for example, a Campbell Hatton, and look at the career trajectory that they have gone in. So Conor Benn, to get to this point in time, is something that really, really needs its plaudits. And he does have some decent names on his record, but when you look at those names in the likes of Vargas, Granados, Algieri, Van Heerden, realistically, they are all welterweights, and even maybe in Algieri's case, a light welterweight, and realistically, all of those men were coming towards the end of their career. You know, if you look at BoxRec, I don't know how many of those opponents have even boxed since the Conor Benn fight. So when he has returned to the ring, he's actually boxed up at light middleweight, and it looks like he's lacked some of the power that he showed in those fights before. But notice I say power and not explosiveness, because Benn still has erupted on these opponents, and in those same sort of moments that he was doing it before the ban, he was showing more power to be able to get rid of these opponents, whereas now he's not getting rid of them. But I will say it's only 2 fights, it is at a heavier weight, and if we were to look at a Terence Crawford's record, for example, we wouldn't say, right, Terence Crawford's completely lost his power if he went to a points decision twice with opponents. So I'm not ready to write off the possibility that Conor Benn does still have that power, but I don't know whether the power will necessarily be the biggest factor in how Conor Benn should approach a Eubank Jr. fight and should look to beat Eubank Jr. Because going back to the days of the past, there was one very clear blueprint to beat Eubank Jr., and that was to outbox him. You look at the performances against Billy Joe Saunders, you look at the performances against George Groves, where Eubank Jr. was beat, and outboxing Eubank Jr. was definitely the way to beat him. When you look at George Groves and you look at the power that George Groves has in his hands, and then you look at the fact that he didn't actually manage to drop or stop Eubank Jr., then you'd have to suggest that Eubank Jr. does have a good enough chin to deal with men up at a higher weight, and therefore would be able to deal with anything that Conor Benn brings to the table. But I said this last night on the stream, and I'm going to echo it again here. After seeing the stoppage to Liam Smith, I really can't unsee that stoppage, and therefore I do feel like there's now a second way to beat Eubank Jr., and that is to back him up, to pressure him, to unload on him, and to make him work in the moments that he doesn't want to work. That is something that Kamil Szeremeta was not able to do to Eubank Jr. last night. Sometimes when Eubank Jr. was getting his work off, he was then opting to take moments to rest, recover, and to get that energy level back up. And if Conor Benn is able to spot when he is taking those moments, then he can force the pace on him, and therefore maybe drag him into deep water, make him uncomfortable, force him to fight rather than box. And I truly do believe that this should be Conor Benn's strategy. I don't necessarily believe in doing so that this will be a route for Conor Benn to win the fight via stoppage, but what I would be looking to do if I was Conor Benn here would be look to bank on my fitness, bank on my cardio and my engine, and hope that against the older man in Chris Eubank Jr., this can be something that helps win me the fight. Although that being said, I can completely see a way where Chris Eubank Jr. uses his boxing fundamentals that he has acquired over his pro career and actually just opts to outbox Conor Benn, the smaller man. And if you look at Chris Eubank Jr.'s lead hand, his jab last night, it does have a lot of snap to it. It is a good shot for him. And despite last night not being a vintage version of Chris Eubank Jr., I think we do have to factor in the layoff, the weight cut, and therefore say that that version of Chris Eubank Jr. last night will not be the version of Chris Eubank Jr. that gets in the ring fighting for family legacy against Conor Benn. So I feel that you would have to make Eubank Jr. a bit of a favourite against Conor Benn just because of the names on his resume and the level that he has boxed at, but I would not be writing off Conor Benn in this one. I do think that this is a pure 50-50 50. If I had to put my money on anyone right now, I think I'm going to sit on the fence. I honestly think I do. But going forward, as this fight builds and as we get closer to it, I will definitely be dropping plenty of content around the fight. And as for the rest of the fights on last night's card, I will be covering them with Lawrence Southwecki, either on my channel or on his. So keep your eyes peeled for that, and I will see you all in the next one.